Welcome back to the Wildfire Resistant Homes and Gardens class. Very nice day, makes me think about gardening. And I hope actually this will inspire you rather than discourage you. So, any questions from the first class? We covered home ignition zones and building vulnerabilities. We'll be doing more of that. Just a brief reminder in this class, and home hardening techniques I'm pretty much through talking about. You can always ask questions.
I do have a question, and that is, like when they talk about if there's a fire, you should move your propane tank at least 30 feet away from the house. I was out measuring, and if I were to move it 30 feet away from the house, I'd have it right next to the fence and the neighbor. And so it's like, only what do you do with these things that really don't fit? Because when they show the diagram, they always have this big expanse with lots of garden, lots of grass and all of this. And they really don't show the fact that along the side of my house, I have 5 feet from the side of the house to the fence that belongs to the neighbor. Or the
No.
things that are included in that picture that I'm trying to figure out.
And it's reality for most of us. We don't have large properties. We have subdivisions and bigger part.
Yes, and also in our subdivision, all of the fences are wooden and they're all painted the same color. And, you know, that's not going to change. If we were to change our fence, it would require the agreement of at least 4 neighbors, maybe 5.
Well, work on it someday. But the really important part of the fence that you need to change is just the part that's connected to the house.
Okay.
That's the part that should be metal. The rest of the fence can be wood, but to decrease the vulnerability of the fence, it's largely about vegetation and what you put next to it. So we will cover that some today.
Okay.
And I think a lot of it's just a little soapbox here. A lot of the covenants in homeowners associations are based on past practice that didn't consider wildfire risk. And they're having to change. You can help them do that by helping them with the materials you get in this class, or you can invite us to talk to them as a whole. But before you do that, let's finish the class and then get in touch with me.
Yeah.
Let me see, the propane tank situation. There are a lot of things we can't do that we're advised to do. Your alternatives in a situation like that is to put it in the garage, because that is basically the most protected space that you have, someplace inside when you're evacuating. The other thing is propane tanks are, while they tell you not to keep them within 30 feet of your house, even 10 feet is better to move it away. You know, you move it as far away as you can without endangering something else. And from what I've been researching, a lot of those propane tanks are actually very hard to heat up to the point where they will explode. What is the most vulnerable part of the tank really is the line that leads out. It's made out of rubber or plastic that melts. And so what you need to do is make sure the tank is always turned off. And then it can withstand a lot more heat. But if you have a propane tank that's attached to a gas fixture on your home, you should consider getting a metal foil-colored pipe hose cover, and always keeping that tank off unless you're doing some barbecuing or something like that. Okay? Thank you for the question. Very good one. And everybody still hearing me on Zoom, Tyson?
Yes, we are loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about landscaping best practices. I'm going to repeat things a couple of times because I've learned in teaching this class that sometimes it doesn't get understood the first time, and I'm hoping by 3 times I've said it in a way that you'll really resonate and remember. So to improve the odds of your home surviving a wildfire, you need to take a coupled approach. The approach that encompasses the home as well as the landscape. We're going to talk about fire-reluctant landscaping best practices. There's a handout that I put on the table for those of you in the room with those best practices on it. It's a 2-sided 8.5 by 11 handout. And I wrote that with the blessing of the fire department, and that's what we've adopted essentially for Ashland. It's also available on my website as one of the handouts on my website. We're also going to talk about plant and mulch selection. That will be the latter half of the class. It's usually what people are most interested in. But let's get through some reminders here real quick. This was the graphic that I showed you about home ignition zones. Remember, there's the 0 to 5, 5 to 30, and 30 plus. And in Ashland, we have a third zone, second zone actually in the zone 1A and B, which I will cover in a little more detail. And I'll explain why. Just a quick reminder that the number one source of heat for home ignitions is wind-blown embers. Radiant heat is more intense, so if a bush or tree or fence or building is burning near your house, that creates even more heat than embers would. And of course, direct flame, which is the hottest of all. But there's something new that I've been researching and I'd like to share with you. Well-hydrated, lower flammability vegetation can actually serve as a heat sink, sucking up energy and deflecting embers, which is one reason why it's important to not strip your land bare, especially on a slope. According to one source, the firescaping people that I have their book here, two ecologists from Chico State wrote a book called Firescaping, and it's the latest kind of fantastic resource I have mined to put into the database for you guys to also quickly learn from. Anyway, they talk about fire shelters. These are features shown in the top here where semi-permeable windbreak, meaning that the flames or the embers and the heat can partly go through the vegetation, absorbing that energy, but a lot of it just goes over the top. The problem with a windbreak, a dense windbreak, which is too thick of vegetation or a wall itself, is that the air will go up to it, hit it, and then be tossed up and cause turbulence, which then comes down and deposits the embers right on the other side, usually right next to the house. And since this is an evolving science, I don't have really good information on how far away that windbreak should be, but it is something that we like to talk about because when we talk about fire-resistant landscaping, people sometimes freak out and say, I don't want it to look like a moat or a death camp. We need to have a pleasant place to live, but not all vegetation is bad. It can serve a purpose, and that's my point in showing you this. So all plants are fuel and can burn during a wildfire. There are some terms that can be quite confusing. How many of you use terms like fire-wise, fire-resistant, fire-reluctant? What's the difference? You know, there really isn't much of a difference, but I choose to use fire-reluctant for this reason. Fire-wise is actually a brand name used by the NFPA for a neighborhood program where people get together and they say, I'm going to do certain things to improve the probability of our neighborhood surviving of a wildfire. The bar is extremely low. Like I think each resident only has to work 1 hour a year. You have to have a minimum of 8 people in the community in that neighborhood who agree to it. But the advantage of it is that when they have funds available, sometimes you can get fuel reduction dollars for the community. So they're very popular, but they do not do the job. They just start you talking to your neighbors doing the job, which is great. So I'm not putting it down. But because it's kind of branded, I avoid using that word, even though we all really like it. And then fire resistance is a term that is actually in ecology means that the species comes back after a fire. So it's misapplied in this case in your environment at home. What you're really looking at is fire reluctant, slow to ignite, slow to burn, and spread fire. Okay, just a reminder about the links between the home and the landscape. The roof is where leaf litter collects. Eaves, plants growing under the eaves are an issue. Windows and glass doors can break by heat from burning vegetation. Wall and siding trim is vulnerable, particularly if it's made of wood and there's debris collected at the base. And there are holes in the building, which embers from vegetation burning in your yard can get through. So here's a graphic representation of that. This is actually fairly typical of a home in Ashland or in the valley. You've got a roof with valleys. Notice how that collects litter in the valleys. That's why you're supposed to clean it off your roof frequently so that it doesn't collect and allow more burn time on the roof. Branches overhanging the roof, trees, contribute to that. So that's why we don't like trees to be near the house. Plants under the eaves. You can see this red arrow here. If those plants burn, it's going to go right up into the eaves. And there's plants all along the edge of this house, under the windows. And if you'll also notice, there is a bunch of litter, dead material under the deck and next to and amongst those plants. So this is the area that we're going to talk about today, these vulnerabilities and how to mitigate them. So again, all plants will burn given the right conditions. The closer they are to the building, the greater the likelihood they will cause the building to ignite. There are 4 landscaping conditions which reduce wildfire risk: proper placement of plants, adequate spacing between plants, relentless maintenance, and removing extremely flammable plants from your property. And we're going to go into depth on this. I'll be covering them basically in this order. We'll take a break after maintenance because plant selection is a more difficult one to get through. So let's get started with placement. Do you see any issues with the placement of plants on this house? 0 to 5. They've got stuff there, right? It'll burn.
They're against the house.
They're up against the house, correct. So starting with the 0 to 5, what should be in this zone relative to plants? I mentioned that we have 2 zones in zone 1, 1A and 1B, and I'm going to talk about both of them separately. In zone A, 1A, you may be in a situation where you just don't want to or can't remove the vegetation within 5 feet of your home. So what do? If having no vegetation isn't an option, then consider a well-maintained and irrigated lawn, and they say the lawn should only be 1 inch high within that zone. Or choose small succulents and low flammability plants less than 1 foot tall and planted more than 1 foot away from all walls, and at least 2 feet should be between plants. There should be no vines, ornamental grasses, or evergreen shrubs or trees should be grown in zone 1A. This picture of the wood strawberry is one plant that would be good in zone A. And remember that the more vegetation in the zone, the more maintenance required and the higher the likelihood of wall siding ignition. So this is a quick summary of what you would consider when you're landscaping the 0 to 5 zone. Fire departments are going to universally recommend nothing at all, including no mulches except rocks, pavers, things like that. And with proper precautions, you can have some low flammability plants. How do you know what they are? I will share that with you. No burnable mulches or layering of plants in this zone. Keep it well irrigated and remove dead material often. But what if you have a home like the one in the picture to the left? That is not a wood-sided wall. That's a brick wall. If you had a stucco wall or a concrete wall and there was no wood at the base of it, you could have some bark mulch and plants in here, but what I would avoid is, see that shrub in the middle? That's a sky pilot, some sort of a boxwood, and what you don't see is the window right above it. So they have basically a fire-safe situation here if they would remove that taller vegetation. So here's what one of those, I'm sorry, did you have a question?
Yeah. So I have part of my walls is just those shingles that we never saw. And part of it is that siding that's made with cement in it, supposed to be very low flammable.
Yeah.
So does that count anywhere close to brick?
Okay, the fiber cement board, which is hardy backer, is basically what all of this science is based on, that your house has that kind of siding. I think a small percentage of us actually have that siding, but that is considered fire resistant. And because it's fire resistant, they still say nothing, 0 to 5. It's underneath that fiber cement board is sheathing and flammable materials. So you still shouldn't have things right next to that wall, at least a foot away, with nothing burnable there. And I'm going to talk about putting pavers in that zone. So here's one of those ideal pictures where they have the 0 to 5 free of debris and plants, then a lawn, and then these islands of planted beds. I don't know how many of us have this condition, but that's what they're trying to get you to do. And I try to work with you, and I will through the rest of the class, to figure out what to do if you don't have an ideal condition. But if you have neighbors, which is what Marilyn brought up, you have to hope that they do the same thing. So here's a situation where the neighbors are a little over 10 feet apart. They're actually very good neighbors. Both of them have reduced the vegetation around the house. The fence between them is wood, which is okay because it's not overgrown with vegetation on top of or below it. And there's a metal gate separating the fence from the house. I'm hoping that on the other side of the lower house, between it and the fence, that they don't have any flammable vegetation that would carry the flames from the burning fence to the house. The way I look at every house is you've got to expect your property to burn. How will the fire travel? How will it be stopped? That's the main thing you look at in design. And right now, with what I see on this picture, both of these houses are fire safe, and their gardens are as well. I don't know what the materials were, but I'm assuming that they were fire resistant. So the plant placement in the 5 to 10 zone is this special category I mentioned, where you don't see it in any of the literature or the brochures that are handed out. And the development of this is because that in the literature and the science, they assume you have that cement board sided home, but we don't. Many of us have wood sided homes. So rather than saying, okay, at 5 feet, you can put in a really flammable plant, you'll be fine, we've created this intermediate zone that transitions away, and we tell you what plants you can plant in the 5 to 10 foot zone. Because in doing my research, I learned basically that no plants were suitable to plant, no evergreen shrubs could be planted within 10 feet of the house safely. So the 5 to 10 zone is, I will give you the criteria for what can be planted there in the next slide, but it's a way of enabling us to still have some vegetation near the house if we have a wooden house. So you should avoid combustible mulches, and if they are present, isolate, don't let it migrate into the zone 1A, and don't put mulch under plants or limit it significantly. And if you do have it under plants, isolate each of those plants with something non-burnable. Maintain only healthy fire-reluctant species less than 2 feet tall. Many of us do not do this in our home communities. And then break up the planted areas with non-burnable pavers, rock gravel, or dirt. So the main thing is, I highly recommend no evergreen shrubs or trees, ornamental grasses, or vines grown within 10 feet of a window or glass door. So if you do have some of these, don't put them in front of a glass door or window. And still try to keep them out of the 0 to 5. In zone 2, a few widely spaced, moderately flammable plants may be grown in the 10 to 30 foot HIZ if spaced far apart and properly maintained. 1 or 2 even highly flammable plants, such as a pine, may be planted within this zone if they are spaced about 20 feet apart and cared for as specimen plants, not hedgerows. To reduce wildfire risk, they need to be aggressively pruned up to isolate from surface fuels and avoid planting other plants in close proximity. So the zone 3, which is 30 plus feet from the house, don't plant any plants that have extreme flammability or highly invasive qualities, and remove any plants that's a listed noxious weed. Unfortunately, some nurseries sell listed noxious weeds in Oregon and across the United States. The listing of those weeds is very slow. Generally, they're just mostly invasives, highly invasives, either invasives wildlands or the local environment and wetlands. And then some authorities like Ashland have prohibited plant lists or spatially restricted plant lists based on distance. And I'm not going to go over what it is in Ashland because it might be different in other communities. I think the state fire marshal is also going to be releasing, if they haven't already, codes and ordinances for spacing. So let's look at this placement of and spacing of trees, shrubs, vines, and gravinoids. You know what that is? Those are grassy-like plants. Sedges, rushes, grasses, gravinoids. That's what it is. A grass, sedge, rush, bamboo, anything that has that kind of grassy-like form. So all conifers contain volatile oils and resins, so when they ignite, they burn hotly. Some species, such as all arborvitaes, cypress, and junipers, burn explosively, like blowtorches, casting off extreme heat and tossing embers into the air. To reduce ignition potential of coniferous trees, consider these best practices. At a minimum, remove all conifers located within 10 feet of the building. I'm not talking about the base trunk of the conifer 10 feet away. I'm talking about the crown is 10 feet away. So the base would be further. If growing in the 10 to 30 foot zone, isolate every plant and treat as a specimen tree or shrub. And like I said, that ideally that would be 20 feet apart between trees or groups of trees. And plant conifers individually or in small groups in the 30 to 100 foot zone. I'm going to get more into spacing in another slide. So deciduous trees also are flammable, and you can check their flammability before planting, but some are less so than others. And I would avoid growing deciduous trees within 10 feet of any building to minimize leaf litter on the roof and around the structure. Deciduous trees are preferred over conifer trees in the 10 to 30 foot zone. Don't plant trees where it could endanger the infrastructure of you or your neighbor's homes as it matures. And don't grow trees that are disease prone. For example, planting new ash trees is no longer recommended due to the tree's susceptibility to the emerald ash borer, a pest that feeds upon the bark and bores into the wood. The emerald ash borer has made it to Oregon, although it's in the northern part of the state. We do have a native Fraxinus, but I would suggest not planting it. Disease trees are more flammable, so trees in the genus Fraxinus are generally a poor choice. Most elms, ulmus, are also a poor choice due to Dutch elm disease. And unfortunately, the big leaf maple is showing signs of disease throughout its range. So while this magnificent tree is native, it may also be a poor choice because with climate change, it appears to be declining.
I have a question. Back to where you were talking about the crown versus the base. On my trees, the crown is farther away than the base. So
I can't hear you.
when you're talking about the distance crown versus the base, my trees, the base is closer to the crown. You would go like,
Trying to visualize what you're talking about because, you know, a tree typically grows up from a trunk and then the leaves come out. So we're talking about from the drip line.
okay.
And I will show a picture that shows that. And that's what I'm talking about because you're trying to keep the debris from that tree from being close to the house and having anything flammable underneath it.
All right.
I will be getting back to that. And this slide shows kind of the relationship between shrubs and trees. The conifer in the lower right, note that they have a 2-foot shrub underneath it, and they're recommending that at least 6 feet of cleared space be pruned up from the base of the tree. Well, that means you're pruning up 8 feet. I generally recommend that you do 10. just average. A lot of places are just generally saying set 6, but who grows really short shrubs? Not a whole lot of people. But it's the rule of 3 applies here. The height, 3 times the height of the shrub to the lowest branches of the tree. And then the space between shrubs or small clusters of shrubs, if they're 2 feet tall, there needs to be 4 feet between each one. This is the spacing recommendation. It's a little hard to see in this upper diagram with tree spacing, but what it says is that essentially in the 0 to 5, no trees or parts of trees should be in that zone. That you can have, there should be 18 feet between each cluster of tree in this zone. And if you go further out, they say it can go to 12 feet, further out meaning from 30 to 60, 12 feet between crowns. And further out, it can be as little as 6 feet between crowns. Crown fires are really the hottest kind. And what they're trying to do is create a situation where there can be no crown fire that approaches your home. And that distance requirement for trees would keep the crown fire from occurring. In general, in Ashland, it's a uniform recommendation of 10 feet between tree crowns, or plus small clusters of trees. So what if you're on a slope? Well, at the bottom of this slide, the 0 to 20% slope, flattish ground, that requirement of 2 times the height of the plant wide between groups of plants still applies, but as you go onto a steeper slope, they double that, 20 to 40%, and they make it 6 times larger on a 40% slope. Okay, so here's some general recommendations about planting shrubs and perennials. Avoid shrubs and perennials that retain dead material. Deciduous plants are safer than evergreen plants. Open growth forms with few base branches are safer. Plants with thick leaves and are safer than those with thin or needle-like leaves. Minimize organic mulches and leaves under the shrubs, and prune up the base to break the link with the ground fuels. In the lower picture, you can see a shrub next to a house. Not a great idea, but they essentially follow the rule of 3. By trimming up the base, they've mitigated their risks. And if they choose to keep their shrub there, they understand that they need to maintain that with no dead material underneath. Because that lawn is only like an inch tall. There might be some bark under it, but there's enough distance right there that if that burned, it's not likely to cause the shrub to ignite. In the upper picture, you can see an example of the spacing of shrubs. So one of the main things that I recommend when I go touring people's homes and they say, well, what can I do here? Is I pay a lot of attention to the base of the trees and the base of the shrubs to break that link. Now here's another kind of link, a horizontal link. There should really be no hedges closer than 10 feet to your home, preferably further away. And here's why. You can see that the shrubs and this hedge right here are igniting and the convective air is rising. First it catches first-story porch roof on fire, but that roof isn't even fully engaged and it's already infected the eaves because of the rising hot air. And these hedges are like wicks, a match that takes the fire all along the property. So at a minimum, I try to recommend that if you need a hedge for privacy, seriously consider some decorative metal. If it has to be close to the house in our really crowded neighborhoods, I have switched to using metal fencing. I'd be happy to show anybody about it. And if you keep a hedge, try to break it up every 6 to 8 feet. So what about perennials and ground covers? Again, no plants within 1 foot of a structure. Only grow low flammability species less than 1 foot tall in the 0 to 5. Plants should be less than 2 feet tall in the 5 to 10. And moderate and highly flammable perennials and ground covers can be planted in the 10 to 30 foot zone if isolated in planting beds. While low-growing plants are preferred, it doesn't mean that they can be grown haphazardly. It's possible to prescribe a spacing rule for individual perennials and ground cover because many are spreaders. I mean, it's impossible to prescribe because many are spreaders that need to be contained. My spacing recommendations focus on controlling mass plantings and confining them to beds. If they're growing under shrubs, they can become the lowest rung in a ladder situation. The best practice is to pay close attention to minimizing horizontal and vertical fuel continuity. So here's a picture on the right of a lovely native ground cover, wild ginger. Notice how it is got downed dead oak leaves all throughout it. And this is the problem generally with ground covers, is they act like a net that captures this dead debris, and it's very hard to keep clean. So I'm not saying don't have them, but isolate them. Don't let them be next to the house. And here they have a pathway at the bottom of the picture that breaks it so that if that area starts burning, it won't spread to the house. And that oak tree that's dropping the leaves, and might be some other trees there, you know, that organic material from dead leaves is incredibly important to soil health and plant health. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, because I'm not a proponent either of getting rid of all composted materials. But there are some species that are just so invasive and problematic that they should not be grown, and ivy is among that group. It's also a noxious weed in the state of Oregon. Most species of ivy, and there are quite a few, are actually considered noxious weeds. And you can look that up. They hide debris in this green, beautiful mass that's very likely to ignite. And because they're viney, it spreads vertically and horizontally. So ivy is a really bad plant. And if it grows on buildings, can actually weaken the structure of the building, pulling off the siding and allowing holes for embers to get into. Do not grow perennials and ground covers on mulches within 10 feet of the building, or at least limit it. Prune to keep them short and at least 1 foot from all buildings unless they have a concrete or stone wall. And break up non-combustible materials like with using decomposed granite, gravel, and pavers. Keep well irrigated and free of debris. So I'm repeating myself here because it's important. So grasses. Do not grow ornamental grasses within 10 feet of a building, no matter how lovely they are, because they ignite very easily and support rapid fire spread. No grasses should be grown within 1 foot of a wall unless it is a non-combustible wall. And lawns can dampen fire spread, but like notice in this picture here on the right, they have a mass planting of some sort of a graminoid right next to and underneath a wooden deck. It's beautiful, but you should strive to get rid of something like that because it will be harboring all kinds of dead material in there. And when it gets extremely dry, these are called 1 hour fuels. They dry out very quickly and become very receptive to embers. So here's some vine advice. I've talked about ivy. Again, it's a noxious weed. I wouldn't grow that vine in particular. But if you have any vines, try to make sure that they are not highly flammable types and that you plant them more than 10 feet from structures. Don't allow them to grow on buildings, fences, trees, or shrubs, and prune regularly to minimize fuel load. Because one of the advantages of a vine is that it can become extremely large, create a lot of fuel, and it hides a lot of material. So keep it well pruned. So here's some risk reduction tips that apply to all zones. Remove all extremely flammable and invasive plants if they are present and monitor for possible reestablishment. Avoid mass plantings of all types, even though that used to be the norm. It's no longer advised. Avoid broadcast combustible mulches over large areas. For example, a lot of us see these rivers of bark mulch going all over the neighborhood. Really bad thing. Break those up with some dirt. You can put in walking paths, planting bed barriers, and other features that break up surface fuels. The slide on the right I'm including because this was a home I evaluated in Ashland. I hope the resident isn't necessarily bothered that I'm presenting this. You won't know who they are. They bought a flipped home. And that means that somebody came in, bought it on the cheap, made improvements, and then sold it. And it's a lovely home, but this is the typical flip landscaping response. Cheap and fast. What they did was they put in the backyard a river of bark mulch, a new wooden fence, and on top of it all, a bunch of young arborvitae. And the house that's behind the fence is not theirs. So they have just done a huge disservice to their neighbors by this planting design. If you find that you've got young arborvitae or junipers, just get rid of it. It's one of the worst of all plants for flammability, and you'll see why. So now we're moving on to maintenance. I suspect many of you are gardeners. You know the job is never done. Plants keep growing. So here's some tree maintenance risk reduction tips. Remove dead materials from trees. If you have a type of tree that retains dead twigs or leaves for more than 2 months, consider replacing it. Avoid creating fuel ladders by planting flammable plants under the trees. It isn't necessary to clear all debris under a tree if the tree is properly placed and spaced. Trees need composted debris to retain soil moisture and to get nutrients. Most trees need deep water even in the winter, especially during dry years. So here's not a great diagram showing what it means by the drip line. The crown of the tree, the edge of it, is the edge of the drip line. And so the advice is to prune trees up about 10 feet and not plant under them unless it's short. And you don't have to clear out all the debris. Sometimes people think, oh, I've got to get rid of all of those leaves. Just isolate those areas and let it decompose. One of the things that I choose to do is I really like maples. Maple trees are really good for composting the leaves, is I shred them in advance of the winter season. You know, you collect them in the fall. I put them through a shredder. That helps the shredder community and the soils break them down faster. And then by the spring, I start working it into the soil, and I get all the benefits of the compost, the mulch. Some trees, if you've got a lot of them on your property, are going to produce more than you can possibly compost. In those situations where it's getting really deep, you probably should take some of that away. So again, keep the plants underneath the trees small, avoid layering, and don't starve the trees of nutrients because it's important for their well-being. So I'm going to remind you again that the rule of 3, you should prune up the base of the tree 3 times the height of underlying fuels. If the underlying fuels are simply leaves, maybe you can get away with 6 feet. If it's a shrub that's 2 feet high, you should go 8 to 10 feet. If it's a taller shrub, maybe you should get rid of it. What if it's a fence? I've seen lots of large trees underneath fences. If you go with the rule of 3 and the fence is 6 feet tall, how high up do you think those branches should be underneath that fence?
18.
18 feet above the fence. So it'd have to be a very large mature tree to be able to be pruned up 24 feet altogether, 4 times 6. And if you have a deciduous tree, it's a lot less flammable, but we have a lot of conifers still in town, even though they are dying out. The fencing under them, their mature size, the amount of debris that they're dropping, it's creating a pretty hazardous situation, especially with the Doug fir die-off. Okay, so here's a caveat. Young trees cannot be pruned up more than, or short trees, 1/3 of their height. So it might be a process that takes time to prune up, but you don't really want to kill the tree or make it unhealthy. And if you see a tree that is expressing distress, disease, maybe you should consult an arborist because a dead tree is a flammable tree. So let's assume that you went out and took all these recommendations and you've identified the plants like they do here on the lower left that you need to remove to get the proper spacing or reduce flammability. And after you've got this nicely spaced landscape, well, it's not over with. You're going to have to maintain it. So the job isn't ever done, but that first time through can be the hardest because there's, especially from past planting practices, we overplanted. And now we're going to have to thin it out. I'm going to show you a slide of what it looks like to prune up shrubs from the base, which is something I advise frequently. You see the dead branches there on the left. You take them out and you get a nice lean, clean look. This is what I like to see with manzanita because I love manzanita. I don't want to have to take it out even though it's called a flammable plant, moderately flammable. And it's so important for wildlife that this is my way of mitigating it. I leave it in the yard and I make sure that nothing underneath it's going to start fire. Because it's not one of the species, for example, that just spontaneously combusts like junipers do. They're called pyrophytic. They love fire. So I'm kind of ahead of schedule. I'll take a break, but before I do, are there any questions from the roomies?
So I have a
So Pamela, I'm sorry.
They can't hear over there. Yeah, I understand. I get it. So I have a cement wall along one side of the house. But I should have no plants on, no line growing up there.
If your whole house is concrete and there's no windows, yeah, you could have them growing.
So hard to think of taking so many plants away. I love all that green.
Yes, yes. Well, have me come over and let's talk about it.
I will. Okay.
Because I don't want to lose the beauty of the yard either.
You know,
But you can be selective and choose some of these techniques that I've been suggesting that you won't hear elsewhere to reduce the risk.
mm,
There are a few bad species, though, that I will just say, get rid of it. Arborvitae and juniper are amongst those. Arborvitae, you know, is that columnar tree. Marilyn?
We have a situation where along our garage, this was professionally, quote, professionally landscaped, unquote. And they did not give us enough space in there to have 6 inches from the siding down to the dirt. And it is cement poured siding, and it's down to the foundation. So one of the things that we did do is we cleared, it's not a foot, I think it's about 8 to 10 inches. And we cleared that back so that we could put pavers down, but they're only maybe 2 or 3 inches below the siding. And then we have rocks along the dirt between the siding and the rest of the dirt. Is that going to be enough to give us some protection?
It certainly is a very good start. I mean, yes, it would be really good. The one thing I would add, and I can't tell unless I look at your siding, but make sure there's metal flashing at the bottom edge of the siding to prevent, if you feel up underneath it,
Yeah.
usually they have a kick plate out of wood, and sometimes they flash it and sometimes they don't. If they flashed it and there's no bark mulch and your plants are pruned up, your chances of your home surviving are really good.
I think there's flashing, but I haven't checked there, and then we found that sometimes it be how they follow through.
Yeah.
I'll check that out.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Hold on, we've
So
got a Zoomy question.
Yeah, I'm going to get that. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see the Zoomies. Okay. Janet?
I was wondering about these other kind of fences that are, I guess they're deer fences, but they just have the two boards. They have two boards across the top and then the post, and then they're wire all around. And I was just thinking about trees that are growing above them. Is that same issue in terms of trimming up from them?
I basically consider those fences fire resistant
Oh,
as well.
okay, cool.
What I do with those kinds of situations is I say, is there any chance that the posts or the rails are going to light on fire? And if they are, how would the fire travel and for how long? And in general, they are not an issue if you keep them clean.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, since we're ahead of schedule, we're going to break for 10 minutes. I'll see you at 2 o'clock.
Pausing the.
Okay, I think we're set. Okay, I'm going to get started. So this is the routine oh, just a second, Pamela.
So on that note of, on that same note of living close to other people rather than having lots of land around, am I legally allowed, if my neighbor's tree is dying and many of its branches are on my side of the fence, can I legally cut her tree?
Yes, you can legally cut the branches that are overhanging in your yard.
That helps.
Okay,
But I can't do anything about the dead ones that are on her.
except try to build a relationship with her. Yeah.
Okay.
Great question. Okay, to just go through a routine maintenance summary here, regular pruning, keep the plants the right size and distance from buildings and other plants, remove dead plants and fine debris often, water and mulch smartly to keep the soil and plants healthy. Recently, Jana Valachovic published an article that I really like. In fact, I have a copy of it here. It's also available on the slide at my website, that talks about appropriate landscaping. A lot of the images that you've seen in my show came out of that. Anyway, she says that where plants are placed and how they are maintained are more important than the type of plant selected, which is why I've taken this long to get to plant selection, which is usually the first thing people want to know. But it really makes a difference in terms of placement, spacing, and maintenance. That is key. So we've talked about this a lot, fuel continuity and arrangement and topography, and now we're going to move into plant characteristics. So when you're selecting plants for your yard, with climate change, it can be kind of tricky, but make sure that the plants are right for their location and a changing climate, that they don't burn intensely or facilitate surface or crown fire spread, and do not have invasive qualities. Here are some things when you're picking plants. The characteristics of the plants. I have two little slides here that have these kind of cheat sheets for what you should look for. So a fire-resistant plant usually has moist and supple leaves rather than fine, dry, or dead material within the plant, such as twigs, needles, and leaves. A fire-resistant plant has minimal dead wood and does not tend to accumulate dead material, has low sap or resin content, and sufficient water and nutrients to be healthy. But a more highly flammable plant has dead material and contains volatile waxes, terpenes, or oils in their leaves, twigs, or stems. And one way of determining whether that's true or not is they can have a strong odor when leaves are crushed, but it's not 100% reliable. And sap that is gummy, resinous, and has a strong odor, like when you crush a rosemary. That is the classic, highly flammable shrub, full of oil pits actually in the leaves themselves, which is why they are so problematic close to the house. But deer don't eat them, so they're a good plant for that reason. And another characteristic, which is not included here in terms of chemical content, is things like the euphorbias have a white milky sap, which is full of saponins that is a fire retardant. So they're fire resistant for that reason. And then plants with loose or papery bark can be more flammable. And here's another view of plant characteristics and flammability. There are 7 components. We've talked about all of these at one point or another, but I'm just going to remind you that the smaller the fuel load, the less hazardous. The larger the fuel size, because of surface to volume ratio and drying time. So like something that's 3 inches in diameter is far less likely to burn than something that's 1/4 inch in diameter, because it responds very quickly to a dry atmosphere. The bigger the fuel, the slower the response time. So the smaller the fuel, the higher the hazard. If it has high moisture content, it is less likely to burn. But one of the problems I have with moisture content from reading the literature is that it changes daily, changes seasonally. It's very hard to predict, except for some species like cactus or succulents that are inherently full of a lot of water. Does it have a vertical component, ladder fuels? Does it have, or is it patchy and widely spaced, in which case, oops, I am sorry, it would not be able to carry fire spread well. So dense fuels that are growing close together and continuous are a higher hazard. This one here on compactness, a low growing dense and compact fuels, you know, the fuels need air to be able to combust. And so that's why they put compactness in. But it means that the fuels might all be on the ground. And if they're open, upright, and loosely arranged, then they're aerated, well aerated, which is why they put that in as a characteristic. But it's a complex one, because if it's highly full of resinous materials and chemicals, the low-growing plant's going to burn really well too, dense. And then the chemical content, I talked about that already. One way to determine what chemical content is, although I've been trying to figure this out, there are some plants that do tell us. They have shiny, waxy leaves. They might be higher flammability, but it's a hard one, because something like the American laurel that we have a lot of in town, shiny, waxy leaves, and it's actually fairly low fire risk compared to other plants. So these things are relative. They're not totally accurate, but in general, broad, thick, green leaves are less flammable than thin, little ones that smell. So a low flammability plant is one that's slow to ignite, sustains combustion for a short time, and burns with low intensity. And now that I've talked to you all about combustion, you'll understand why I'm emphasizing this. Like here's a plant in the middle that has kind of moist, green, succulent-looking leaves. It's not retaining any dead materials, although underneath it there is, but this is generally a low flammability plant. You could just look at it and say, that looks like a low flammability plant. What's interesting is that maples, like this maple here, the vine maple is native to Oregon, a great plant, highly recommend it. But in testing, they discovered that the leaves of the maple are one of the most flammable leaves, but they dry out, burn quickly, and then there's nothing left. So they don't sustain heat for a long time. They don't generate a lot of heat, but they just wilt and die.
Cherise,
Yeah.
Amelia had a question in the chat area, but please explain size again. Amelia,
Okay.
you'll follow that up.
Okay, so the diameter of a fuel, like think of a campfire with a log in it. Are you going to light that log with a match? It probably won't light, because the fuel is so thick. It doesn't have enough room for the chemical reaction for the materials to start burning. So if you've got a little needle, it has a lot of surface to volume ratio. It's aerated really well, and when it's exposed to heat, it dries out quickly and it ignites quickly. So the size and shape of fuel matter. And so what they're trying to say is that large branches do not burn. I think we all kind of intuitively know that. Does that answer the question? There is something of an intermediate category, which is punky wood. Punky wood, rotten wood has been breaking down and has a lot more surface area, and anything that lands in it, or if it's exposed to sunlight, it dries out quickly. So you could start a punky log on fire quicker than a solid one. Did that work, Tyson?
She's nodding her head
Okay.
and smiling.
Okay, so this is just a summary. And remember, all these slides are available to you I post them after class. And so you can come back and look at these things and remind yourself. You don't have to take notes. But plants with papery, thin leaves and shreddy or peeling bark, and plants that are dense and multi-stemmed at the base can be moderate to highly flammable. If they retain a lot of dead debris for more than 2 months or are unhealthy, they are more likely to be highly flammable. Invasive and spreading plants increase horizontal fuel continuity. Climbers create vertical continuity. All vines are considered moderate to highly flammable for this reason. Of course, if any plant contains resins, oils, or waxes, it is likely to be highly flammable. So what are the extremely flammable plants? Oh, go ahead, Marilyn.
One of the questions I have is you're talking about thin, narrow leaves, and that the thicker leaves tend to not catch fire as quickly. And yet, in another time you were talking about you shouldn't have evergreens planted in lots of places, but a lot of the evergreens that are broadleaf plants do have those types of leaves that you're saying don't ignite as well. So does it mean you shouldn't have a madrone or a strawberry madrone or something like that?
What I'm saying is you shouldn't have those plants planted closer than 10 feet to the house. Because once they get burning, they generate a lot of heat. And if you keep them from burning by trimming up from the base and not letting weeds or debris collect underneath them, then they won't burn as easily. So some of those evergreen shrubs are fine. The ones that are problematic are like rosemary, which is just stuffed with oils. Thank you for the question.
Therese, we have Carol Carlson on a chat here, Zooming chat. How far away should a wood pile be? Carol, do you want to elaborate on that question? Carol?
Well, it's more than 30 feet away from my house, but it's next to a cedar fence that is about 8 feet from my neighbor's house.
So we had this question in the classroom. And let me answer it again for you. They advise having your stored wood, lumber, all those kinds of piles 30 feet from of structure, including fencing. How many of us can actually do that safely? Not a whole lot. So my advice is to put it as far away as you can and never under a conifer. You can also cover it with fireproof tarp, which is extremely expensive, or regular tarp, which will usually flap and blow off and is not a very good protection. But if you get the heavy duty polyurethane kind of tarps, they are more fire resistant. In general, what we advise is putting the ignitable material like firewood inside a structure that is not going to burn, or getting it as far away from things that you value as possible. My philosophy is expect your property to burn. And I look at the firewood pile and I say, what would happen if that firewood pile burned? What is next to it? What's adjacent to it? What's above it? Can I break the link by dealing with that instead of the firewood pile? I find that really helps me make decisions. Okay, does that help, Carol?
It helps, except wherever I get 30 feet away from my house, I get closer to my neighbor's house. But I heard about covering it with something during the season, during the hot season.
And what I chose to do, because I'm really into this stuff, is I put all my lumber and wood in it.
You built a what?
Metal shed.
Ooh. Ah. Well, that's something to think about. What did it cost a lot?
It didn't cost a lot because I do my own work.
Ah,
And I used roofing panels. So, you know, I bought the materials and I figured out how to do it. And we put screening inside so that there would be no hole more than an eighth of an inch wide. And it's built next to my neighbor's house on a wooden fence.
oh, thank you for that. I love these good ideas.
What I did also is I replaced my fence with metal.
Uh-huh.
And so I feel very confident now that my wood pile is not going to cause the neighbor's home to burn or my garage to burn. And because I think his house is much more likely to burn than mine, it's also a shield.
Mm, good point.
Okay, moving on. Great questions. Extremely flammable plants. So what have I mentioned so far that's in the extremely flammable category? Arborvitae, juniper,
Rosemary.
rosemary,
Ivy,
ivy.
Lavender.
Lavender is not really, but it's not an extremely flammable plant. And
I burnt it. It exploded when it was.
okay, it can. And what I was telling folks in the classroom during break about lavender is that there's a publication by Oregon State University that recommends lavender as a fire-resistant plant. And that publication was produced in 2006, and it is still the main reference source that is passed out by fire departments. In Ashland, they prohibit it within 30 feet of a building. So what's the story here? Well, in doing my research on lavender, I found that young lavenders are not very flammable relatively. The older they get, the more flammable they get. They have shreddy bark, they catch dead materials, and they're full of volatiles. Pollinators love them. Deer don't eat them. There are places in our yard for lavender. The one that's more problematic is rosemary. There's no question that it will burn explosively, regardless of age. So extremely flammable plants fall into the fourth category of landscaping conditions that I want you to pay attention to, which is don't plant them, don't grow them in your yard. Try to get rid of them. If they're in their neighbor's yard, talk to them about it. Extremely flammable plants are generally large, sprawling, and have feathery or needle-like leaves. They often contain abundant volatile chemicals, but not always. They all produce, shed, and retain abundant fine fuels within their body, and some ignite extremely quickly, and others burn explosively. Juniper and arborvitae do both. So here's a peek inside something like an arborvitae. Look at all that dead material into that mask of green. It burns explosively. It attracts embers and they just love it. They immediately start burning it. And if it's next to a house, like on that slide to the right, there's this whole privacy screen of arborvitae. This is in my neighborhood, by the way. It's really bad. But other highly flammable plants that I hope get banned from the city are bamboo, including the non-spreading varieties, pampas grass, and jubata grass, mast ornamental grasses. Those I think have a place. Rooms are currently a prohibited plant. Any arborvitae, juniper, cedar, or cypress. Even the dwarf varieties are highly flammable and not recommended. If you choose to have one of these, like I said, in that 10 to 30 foot zone, you can have one specimen, but don't have a whole hedgerow of them. I sound a little bossy, I apologize. Something that happened when I first started exploring this was that I looked at the Firewise plants list for Ashland. How many of you have looked at that resource? It's a 3-page brochure. I have some if you want to look at it, but we're throwing them away. In it, there's some exceptions to the rules. For example, dwarf varieties of conifers are not subject to the same prohibitions. And that's dumb. Just really is, because they're right there on the ground. Mugo pines are everywhere and they are problematic. They're more problematic than those big conifer trees, because the conifer trees, you can break that link between the ground fuels and the lower branches, but a mugo pine's right there on the ground. So,
Lugo pine?
mugo, M-U-G-O, and they're very common. I'll show you a picture further on. So this is the inside of that plant list, the Ashland product. Beautiful color threefold brochure. If you have it, I advise you to throw it away. Not only does it have some misinformation on it, but there's some errors. Like it says the deer-resistant plants are, and then if you look at those plants, it's the opposite. So there's problems with it. And what I have learned by looking at all of these plant lists from all different sources across the United States and the world is that all Firewise and fire-resistant plant lists are suspect, including the OSU fire-resistant plant publication, Ashland's Firewise plant list, and every other source. And I am just going to duck away for a second. I don't know if you can see this in the picture, but this is the SOU fire-resistant plant publication. It's about 30 or so pages long, very beautiful, laid out, but it has problems. Some of it is good, some of it isn't. I'm just asking you to be aware that they did not do routine testing of all of the plants, and I'm going to get into that. Tyson, were you able to see that?
Not really with the, what I called your presentation there. It wasn't possible to really show it large enough. You might want to show it at the end when you complete your presentation.
Okay, it's called the Fire Resistance Plants for Home Landscapes, Selecting Plants That May Reduce Your Risk from Wildfire. It was produced for the whole Pacific Northwest. Okay, so there is no standardized guidelines for testing plant flammability. Researchers use different testing techniques, different testing temperatures, different growing environments, and do not control for the same plant conditions such as growth phase, plant time, part, time of day, and year. Another person like me who's not really trained in horticulture, but just loves to garden, named Leslie Corbett, got inspired to look at plant flammability testing around the world. She came up with a book with the results for 500 species, and I incorporated her findings into the plant list generator that I will show you at the end of class. But I have this publication, it's called Safer Gardens, and it's quite interesting. But I'm going to show you some finding that she put in it. Here's an example where the Americans, the darker green below, and the French tested the same species, Pyracantha coccinea, scarlet firethorn. Note that the French test results classified this species as moderately flammable, and the Americans classified it as having low flammability. The French took their materials from hedges growing in Provence, France, and tested it in the late summer when it was likely to be most dry, right? The Americans took a 2 to 3 year old potted plant and tested it who knows when. And then they used different ranking factors for flammability between the two researchers. So this is typical.
So it's not standardized.
It's not standardized at all. And I'm working with the Insurance Business of Health Institute of Business and Health Safety. They have a scientist assigned to this question, and I'm hoping to see if I can encourage them to do standardized testing. But before I go to that, if you do research online, you might come across a native plant nursery in Colitas that has tested hundreds of species of native plants just for the leaf flammability, just the leaf. What does that mean? There's all these other factors that affect it. So I'm suspect of garage testing. So we're now going to go into mulches. I know this question has come up several times. What's important about this graphic is it shows you the test results from mulches tested in Nevada And if you look at the far left column, that is shredded rubber. Shredded rubber, and if you look at the bottom brown, that represents how hot, see, yeah, the temperature it burns at. It generates a huge amount of temperature, a huge intensity. It doesn't go all that fast, but it has a huge flame length. Shredded rubber is the absolute worst mulch you could get. And I think, Lucille, you had some? So one of my students in the fire risk assessment class had shredded rubber, and she's removed it all. Thank you. The next column over is pine needles. You can see that they don't get nearly as hot, but they burn very quickly, and they have moderate flame lengths. The next one over is shredded western red cedar. Where does that come from? The Pacific Northwest. This is a very common mulch in our area. It's about as hot as a pine mulch, but it burns a little more quickly, little shorter flame. Those three are really bad mulches. The ones in the middle there are varieties of mulches from Nevada, like a vendor created them. The one in the middle is called medium pine bark nuggets. And what you can see there, this would be the larger chunks of bark mulch, is that it generates a lot of heat, doesn't move really fast, but it has huge flame lengths also. So there's been this question from one of the students in the class and at other places that isn't the bark mulch that's got large chunks better? This tells us it's not. It generates a lot of heat and it will burn quite easily, and I have a video to show that. So if you go down this line to the safest product, it's composted wood chips. And it still generates a lot of heat, but you can tell the way it burns, it hardly spreads, and it has a short flame length. So it is probably the best choice of wood bark type mulches.
Is it available commercially?
I don't really know because this product was from them, but I'm going to show you the next slide. I believe that middle photo there might be something like composted wood chips. I don't know for sure. These are all pictures from a local vendor of their products. There are many more, but you'll notice that they have different size and textures. None of them are great, but the one in the middle might match the recommendations from that study. I just can't tell you for sure because we didn't test that. But the bottom line is all bark mulches will burn. And I've noticed that in playgrounds, they have to have a certain kind of wood chip that's not splintery. And I suspect that doesn't burn really well. It will smolder and burn a long time, but it's probably not going to move very far. So I'm going to play this video. Some of you may have seen it. It's available on Fire Adapted Ashland.
When the Alameda fire swept through the valley, we saw the power of devastating fire in our communities. Its rapid spread was often caused by burning bark mulch, directly igniting buildings and also fueling a constant stream of windborne embers, igniting even more mulch and even more buildings. To better understand mulch flammability, we ran tests on local products to find out how flammable mulch products are, and if any are safe to use near buildings. 3 conclusions came from our testing. Number 1, commonly used bark and wood mulches made of large chunks created high flames, spread quickly, and threw lots of embers. Number 2, fine-grained wood mulches didn't burn as readily, but they still burned, and if used next to a building, could ignite it. Use these products sparingly, at least 10 feet away from buildings. Number 3, the one product that resisted burning is not what you'd call bark mulch. It contains a high percentage of soil and really no discernible wood at all. Our testing proved that few bark and wood mulches are safe. Fine-grained mulches can be used sparingly away from all buildings, and mulch containing mostly soil and no wood can be used anywhere. We can experience a fire without having a tragedy. Changing the first 10 feet around your home or business is a critical step.
Our changing climate with extreme temperatures and increased wildfire risk demands that we rethink our landscaping. There are less flammable mulching options that can provide the same moisture retention and weed control as bark and wood mulch. If you do have reason to use mulch, use it wisely and further than 10 feet from your house. Keep wood mulch to a minimum and use the less flammable types. Let's consider some fire-smart alternatives. An excellent and safe alternative is rock mulch. Rocks don't burn, they come in many colors, sizes, and textures, and they're easy to find locally. Rocks don't need to be replenished each year, saving money. Rocks are also better for bug and rodent control, and they help keep moisture away from siding and foundations, further reducing rot. Another strategic alternative is bare soil, the cheapest option of all. It takes maintenance to prevent weeds, but it's a very clean look. In areas with no traffic, it's okay to leave it bare. Another alternative to consider is hardscaping. Materials like pavers, flagstones, and walkways can be used to eliminate the need for wood mulch against the home. There are many great designs and materials you can use around your home or business to create a safe and attractive landscape.
Please do your part to protect our community. We're in this together. See fireadaptedashland.org to learn more about wildfire safety.
I'm going to stay with mulches for a second, but this story, this picture is really one I want to share. This is a home in Talent. And based on the first class, you know that the Almeida fire got to Talent around an hour, 2 hours after it started. And in this neighborhood, it burned down pretty much all of the homes. And the people that lived here evacuated along with everyone else. They came back at night, around 10 or 11 at night, and they saw the corner of their garage starting to burn. It started burning the wood trim. I don't know for sure if this is wood siding or not, but you can see the scorch marks on it. And underneath was some bark mulch. So it took 10 hours for that bark mulch to dry it out enough. And look, there's the 6 inches of clearance before the trim started burning. And what they found was in their car, they had a bottle of water, and in the hose, a little residue of water. And they put So this really tells you how insidious a layer of bark mulch can be next to the house, even with the 6 inches of clearance. So you saw the film on testing. That's a recent publication or video. And what were the results of that testing? What is the local winner? It is, and I'm going to share this with you because I can. I'm a volunteer. I can actually talk about products. They can't. So the winner is the Rogue Valley Waste Transfer Station fine compost, which they claim is certified to be can be used in organic gardens and farms. There was one other locally sourced product that we have never been able to verify whether they still have, so I can't recommend it. I don't even know what it's called. But this product I have put all over my yard. And something I want to counter a little bit about what she said in the film was that it should have no wood. Well, if you look closely at this, and if you remember the picture where there was a glove holding the composted mulch, that was from my yard. And there are wood particles in it. It isn't completely wood-free. It's just well composted. And the chunks are not so numerous that it carries a lot of fire. And it's a really fine material, so it suffocates the fire. And when it was tested, it just wouldn't spread. So it's a product that we currently recommend. This slide shows what you should look for. And in 2023, it was $4.99 a bag, $28 a yard. I checked around the valley. This is the cheapest product in the valley for compost. And they say it's good for organic yards. So it's good for pollinators. So let's look at other composting options, or mulching options. So I'm going to briefly talk about gravels because they're commonly recommended as a fire-wise landscaping medium. The best non-combustible dirt gravels have little to no organic debris. And if rock is used, I highly recommend applications of heavier gravels, those that are 1 inch wide and heavy. I do not recommend any gravels that are pea-sized or 3/4 of an inch in size or so, or cinders, because they are lightweight, becoming little missiles when blown with a leaf blower. Avoid using any product that combines bark and other fine burnable debris with the gravel, like it does in the second from the right on the bottom here. It's a mixture of pumice and bark mulch. While they will burn, are less likely to flame up and burn, they will still smolder and spread heat. And finally, this is a personal plea, do not use vermiculite in your soils. It's a micaceous material, a collection of tiny bits of glass, and the material is easily transported into watersheds where it is consumed by fish. And the fine silica particles lacerate the lungs of fish so they die. So I came up with this paver solution against my house because I'm lazy and I don't want to have to get leaf litter out of gravel next to the siding of my house. In this picture, just note that I don't have the requisite foundation clearance because this is a shed and it's only 4-inch slab, so you won't see the 6 inches, but ideally that distance between the base of the siding and the pavers would be 6 to 8 inches. But by essentially, if you see how the leaves accumulate right up next to the siding on the left side, if it collects on top of the pavers next to the siding, I just take a broom or a blower and push it off. And if there's a red flag warning, I'm done in half an hour with my whole property. So I like this solution because it's such easy maintenance. And you can see in the slide above, I've shown this before, where there's gravel underneath siding and all that fine litter debris that's under there. It accumulates, it causes rot of the siding. But over time, as we live in our homes, we bring more and more materials in next to the house and it raises that level. And even if it is gravel, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem to throw gravel down next to your house. Use it for pathways and things like that. You want to have a clean surface there if you can. So we're getting into plant selection now, multiple objectives. These are the kinds of objectives that I had for my yard: beauty and fragrance, habitat, food for pollinators, birds, and other wildlife. Requires little water, improves soil health. I like to eat my yard. It's deer resistant, easy to grow and maintain. And this last one, heat tolerant, is a new category that I haven't been able to research very well, but with climate change, I'm like those big heat domes we had. So the maples are really suffering in that case. Got me thinking about it. Other considerations are they invasive? Are they drought tolerant in a changing climate? What really is meant by deer resistant? If any of you have a real big deer problem, you'll know that there's nothing that a deer won't try. So a deer resistant plant is one they won't consume. You need to expect some nibbling at least. But there is a degree of deer resistance, and depending on where the deer live, some are less picky than others. So around here, I think they are pretty good at eating a lot more than they would elsewhere. The question of whether native plants are more flammable, you might have heard that native plants are more flammable because they are fire adapted. They are meant to burn. And there's been research in California that's showing that's not necessarily true, that they are somewhat more resistant in some cases to burning. So I don't believe that myth anymore. And also when you are planting, you need to consider habitat for the plant, light, shade, water, and which nurseries have the right plants. So far, this is an area that I have not been able to research, but I'm hoping that we get to that in the next couple of years where we educate the landscapers, the nursery growers, to grow the right kind of plants for fire resistance. So I've mentioned a couple of times the plant list generator. This is the result of about 2,000 hours of work by me and my husband, where I took all of the information I could find about plant flammability and other attributes like what kind of shade, how big they grew, etc. And I put it all into a database and I put it online so anyone can use it. I'm going to talk more about this till the end of class or toward the end of the class. If you can read on this slide, you'll see that there's a plant. The first one that shows up is Abelia. That's the first one in the database. It has a common name, garden facts, and photo lists. In this case, the one that shows up is a link that if you clicked on, it would take you to a plant flammability testing source. Not all of them have them, but it's one, or it might take you to the Oregon Flora or Calscape or some other place to learn more about the plant. You'll see that there are hazard ignition zones in here. List choices, there's a Charisis list, like Angie's list, but for plants. And there's coding in here that essentially triggers the filters. And what you can also see are comments and best practices. So it will tell you, in this case, VCE claims it is highly flammable. And all of this information is sourced with codes. Most people don't seem to care about the sources, but I put them in here because I'm a scientist. And then I list several sources that say it's moderately flammable. Then Anaheim, California claims that it has low flammability. This is an example of what I was just trying to tell you about flammability. A lot of opinion. And it says a lot of other things about the plant. And if you plant it, then I put in risk reduction best practices recommendations for that species. Okay? You can download this plant list generator yourself by going to my website and clicking on Plant List Generator. There's downloading instructions, but it is not for the complete novice. It's kind of, you have to have some comfort with computers because you have to download an Excel file onto your computer. And if you can't download that Excel file, you can go to the library and do it there. In any case, I am looking for $10,000 to get this reprogrammed to be online interactively, but I haven't found it yet. Let me go back here. So the third sheet in the Excel file is what's called the master. The first two sheets, one is an introduction to the database. The second is the instructions for how to use it. And the third is where the data actually lives. And then there's some other tabs like the sources of information and their coding. So it's really very powerful. But if you hit the blue generate filtered plant list, you will see a screen. The screen that comes up is this, something like this. And you can pick which hazard ignition zone am I interested in looking for plants in? Do I only want to look at Charisis list? What, like I only want to look at maybe ground covers? You can pick so many different options to do this search. I want to pick it because it smells good. I want to look at only low water requirements or ease of growth or erosion. You know, there's all of these variables you can filter on. The more you filter on, the fewer plants you'll get, okay? I've done research on all of these attributes. If I found something, it's included. So if something is not included, like some plant is deer resistant, it's because I didn't find anyone who said it was. So it's all sourced. In any case, this is the first filter screen. If you were to, you can see here that I asked for what in the 10 to 30 foot zone on the consider list takes very little water, and 143 matches came up. See that at the bottom of the screen?
You put this together?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Impressed.
If you press the next button, it will take you to another screen which gives you options for printing out what you want to see. So if you pick these things, but not the wildlife benefits, when you go on the next screen, it will automatically say whether it's native or wildlife benefits because you click that because you say, I want to know whether this plant has those attributes. Okay, so there's two filters. Here's an example where I did a search for Oregon native deer-resistant plants with very low water needs suitable for the 10 to 30 foot zone. I found 31 plants. So I'm excited about this because all these questions you have, in the next class, those of you who are on Zoom, I can't help with the computer side of things, but you can ask me, like, is this plant flammable? Or, and I can look it up without the filter, but I'd have to show you how to do that. I'm going to keep going here. And this is what a plant list looks like. You can see genus, species, whether I know the cultivar, common name, and then it has flammability notes and risk reduction notes. In this case, I asked for it to print out what the plant structure was, but my original filter up at the top is in red. I asked for hazardous ignition zone 0 to 5 and whether the plants were native.
Charisse, Jan has had a question.
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't find that first place where you went to filters. I got the master list, and did you choose that under the master, or did you choose it under plant list when you made the filter?
Are you going to be in the next class?
Oh yeah.
Okay, because I'm going to get into that level of detail in the class. Right now, I'm just trying to pique interest.
Okay, yeah.
And you can play with it the whole time. Okay? So this is an example of a plant list. It can be printed out in Excel or in Word. Here's an example where I picked out 5 to 10 foot zone. Charissa's list, is it invasive? Tells me what the flammability is, plant structure, and whether it has deer resistance. So, I mean, any number of combinations you can come up with here. So I mentioned that there are these fire-reluctant landscaping best practices. Basically, what I taught today is summarized in a 2-page handout available to you folks in class on my website. It's one of the listed documents, and there's some hard copies here in the classroom if you want them. This has replaced the Ashland Firewise plants list. It tells you about spacing, placement, restrictions, things like that. And also, just off this screen is the link to the plant list generator. So the city of Ashland is promoting this plant list generator because it gives you information and you make an informed choice. And when you get a landscaper on your property, get them to look at this before you make a decision to go with their plan. Okay, so this slide kind of ties it all together. It's a planting plan done by a local landscaper where I want to just tie it all together here before I ask you questions. The house is in the middle in white. The red is the 0 to 5. The yellow is the 5 to 10, and the green is the 30. You can see that on this plot of land, some of the 30 flops over into another parcel of land. At the bottom, I don't know if you can see this very well, but there is these contour lines, and it shows that there's a riparian corridor, a little creek there, and the lines are really close together on that lower left corner, which means that if a fire comes up the riparian corridor, which is most likely, and then runs up toward the house, this area of the house is most vulnerable. But look how densely it's planted. And if you looked closer at the key for what they propose to plant, you would see, you could look and say, oh, that species is highly flammable and it's in the 0 to 5. So this is a tool that the city now can use to evaluate planting plans. They could look up the plants one at a time, but this is just ties it all together, the topography, the house, and the zones, and the plant species. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you some questions. And since I can't see those on Zoom, Tyson, would you let me know if somebody raised their hands and wants to answer these questions? I will start with Zoom first.
Okay.
How can you make this home safer?
Get rid of the juniper.
Yeah, there's a juniper in the lower corner. I think the tree is something else.
I don't know what it is. Get rid of that big tree.
Yeah. It's clearly a conifer with a lot of dead stuff in it, very dense, right up next to the house. Good choice. And then I'm going to go to the room next. So roomies, how could you make this home and garden safer? Can you take the microphone when you speak up, please?
Well, there's a bush right up, there's a couple bushes right under windows. that would need to go. And there's one right in the corner, very near the base of the house that would need to go. And then probably some of the branches of the big tree would need to be cut back so it doesn't drop stuff onto the roof.
It would be hard to get that tree far enough away from the house, wouldn't it? Yeah.
And then there's to the lower left corner, there's a little bit of stuff, but plenty of
On the
there's a lot of stuff that's growing around the house, maybe probably all the stuff right around the house with papers on it. So,
All right. Anybody want to add to that, or is it
Well,
good?
I have a question.
Say that
Would you be
again.
able to, I have a question. Would you be able to trim that big tree up enough from the house?
It depends on its total height, but it looks to me like you could trim it up pretty far. And because it's between two homes, there's a chance of saving that tree, but there's an intermediate tree underneath it. So that's the combination of all of that dense vegetation. It's clearly a ladder to that tree. And so it would need to be thinned out significantly so that the tree wouldn't start on fire. And one of the things that is kind of a mythology is that trees cause houses to burn. Usually it's the other way around. Houses cause trees to burn. I think what would happen in this case is if you got rid of the ladder fuels and kept the house from burning, the tree would survive and not burn the house. But you'd have to do a lot of work to break it up. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, next one is for the Zoomies. How can you make this home and garden safer?
Well, get rid of the conifer right near the house.
Yeah, this is an example of a sculpted, I think it's a mugo pine, right under the eaves of the house next to the wall in the garage. I can't tell, but that fence right there might be made of metal. They've got a rockway, a paver rockway there, and deciduous trees, but they might consider whether that combination, that thickness of trees, shrubs under the other trees is worth keeping. But the main thing is that pine growing under the eaves. And I know this homeowner, and they're so attached to it, they're not going to remove it. So what do you think you can do?
Keep it clean.
Yeah, you keep it clean of dead material and you prune it up from the base as much as you can. And don't let anything grow underneath it. So that's the kind of advice I usually give is if you just love something and you can't get rid of it, what do you do? And you try not to let it touch the house. Okay, this is for roomies.
Take out the arborvitae. So take out the arborvitae.
They're not quite 30 feet away, but even that close, they're a problem.
The tree growing by the stairs should be removed because it's too close to the house.
There's a lot of shrubs there. I don't know if they connect.
It looks like there's another tree that's kind of behind the stairway area that's right next to the house too. There,
That looks like a conifer.
yeah.
There's also this tree in the front. We don't know how close it is to the roof, but as it gets older, it's likely to start becoming a problem.
Yeah. And they might need to keep those trees of deciduous trees that are kind of in a row to the right, coming back too.
Yeah, they do have about a 10-foot clearance between the roof and those conifer trees. It's the one that's closest to the house that's depositing leaves that would be an issue. The lawn is wonderful, even though lawns are not good for water consumption. You know, they've got a really good strong start here.
What would you do with those bushes that are down low? Would you need to prune those bushes that are down low, or would you be able to leave those in that situation?
The bushes are in the 0 to 5. So if you wanted to keep them in here, you would have to do meticulous maintenance and prune them up from the base. And I would try to isolate them from each other. Because right now it's a continuous hedge. You remember that video or that picture where the hedge is burning the roof of the house? This is the same situation. So if it got started under one of these, it would burn the house down. Good job. Okay, this one is for zoomies.
The maple under the window and that whole border over there is a problem for the house on the right.
Uh-huh. And see, these houses are really close together. And I can't really see really well, but under that maple are generally fire resistant, they're good, but there's bushes underneath it. So it could cause it to light right under a window. So this is, again, a 0 to 5 problem. And these houses are all close together, finally kind of typical of an HOA. And I'm going to just talk about this one myself because we're almost out of time. Here's a picture of a mugo pine right here on the lower right. You see how it's right close to the ground. Very beautiful, but it's not good to have except in isolation. And in this photo in the middle, you can see how there's leaf litter right up next to grasses and some other plants and right up next to and under the deck. And it's a wood deck. So, really good. I'm going to move on now. Again, I want to remind you that I put resources links in my Living with Fire website, and you can also get more information at Fire Adapted Ashland and Fire Safe Marin. I told you what tabs to look at. Thank you for your attention today, and I have one more slide, and it's about the next class. So I have received some photos and questions from students. Thank you so much, because this is what we are going to cover in the next class. For the first hour, we're going to look at any questions you have about your properties, but I need to basically receive those pictures to be able to post them. So please try to get to them to me by next Tuesday. And if you're interested in uploading the plant list generator and having help with it, and you should come to the classroom. And you need a laptop. But if it's an old laptop, it might not run Excel macros. You might be able to download Excel, but if you click on the Excel file and it doesn't work, it's because your software or your computer is too old. You cannot, we learned in our last class, run the Excel database on tablets, iPads, or Macs. And Zoomies, you can tune out after the first hour if you want, or you can stay and ask questions, and I will run the plant list generator and find answers to your plant choice questions as best as I can in that hour. And you can also send me questions yourself on email about anything in particular, any plant you want to know, or I can generate a plant list for you for those of you who can't generate your own. And there are instructions on how to do this if you go to the library. On the website, there's an instruction sheet for that. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention.